I've had people email me as recently as this morning saying, well, I was down to Cape Point this weekend saying goodbye because I'll never be back again. I've buried 2 friends by scattering their ashes on these beaches in places where I can no longer go, and their family can no longer go. Senator Hagan was here last year for general meetings with the public, as she does, and I laid 3 photographs in front of her. And during the conversation, she looked and she finally said, okay, what was the significance of these photographs? The first one was a man in a wheelchair. His 2 sons were with him, and he was sitting there with a fishing pole stuck in his wheelchair, and he was fishing. The next picture was 2 little girls frolicking in the surf. They happened to be my granddaughters, but they were just 2 children frolicking in the surf. And the next picture was a gentleman standing, or sitting actually, on the beach with his walker next to him. And his son was bringing him some supplies from their vehicle. And I said, well, Senator, I said, the real significance of these 3 pictures is they can never be taken again, because these people, nobody can go there anymore under these conditions. That's the sad thing about this whole thing. I'm here to talk a little bit about what's happening within Cape Hatteras National Seashore Recreational Area. Some people don't recognize recreational area as being part of the name, but that is the name that Congress gave this facility when it was originally established. Under this current rule, visitors to this seashore, a seashore that was bought, paid for, it's maintained at the cost of the American public. Our taxes do this. Well, now, or beginning on February the 15th, to drive your vehicle on the seashore, if you're here for a week, it'll cost you $50 to buy a permit. And you'll have to go in at a time convenient to the Park Service, watch a 7-minute film, sign off that you viewed that film, and pay your $50. If you're a resident such as myself, or if you're a property owner, or somebody that's retired that comes here multiple times a year and want to buy an annual permit, you can do this. It's only $120. That's what the park, only $120. Now, this is an uncalled for expense, and basically this is a cost recovery program. Most of this money they collect will pay for the trailers they have bought and put in place to make these collections, pay for the staff that are going to work at these trailers making these collections, and pay for this film they have produced. Now, after 40 years of working and living and driving on these beaches, I will go watch a 7-minute film instructing me how to drive. And I can understand that, okay, I'm part of the program. But to pay these fees is absolutely ridiculous. So the Park Service has forgotten what recreational area means. It is being turned into, basically, we consider a wildlife area. That's not what it was originally founded for. It was established by Congress for recreation. 15 miles was carved right out of the middle of this park originally, and it was made into Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge. And nobody's had a heartburn over that. We think it's great. We need places like this for birds, turtles, mammals, etc. to come. But now they're basically closing some of the most visited and the most popular areas on this beach. Oregon Inlet, for instance, the spit there at the south end of Buggy Island, for the most part, will be closed. It'll be open part of the year, assuming a bird doesn't land. If he lands, it'll be closed also. You go down to Cape Point. For the most part, Cape Point, the most famous surf fishing area on the East Coast, and some people say in the world, will be closed. You move further south to Hatteras Inlet. Both the north side and the south side of Hatteras Inlet will be closed to vehicle traffic and also to a great extent to pedestrian traffic. And then to the south end of Ocracoke Island and the north end of Ocracoke Island, both of those spits will be closed. This seems totally unreasonable to us and to many people around the country, and this is what we're protesting. It's the overly draconian measures that they're taking for the protection of the birds and mammals. We're behind the bird and mammal protection 100%. We're not arguing the ESA. There's only one ESA, or endangered species, that comes here, and that's a leatherback turtle. We have piping plovers, which are not endangered, but they are on the list, and we respect that. In fact, Beach Buggy Association for many years paid for the interns to come here every summer and study them. We no longer can afford to do that. Park Service is doing that, and we hope the information that's being published is factual, and we have to assume that it is. Now, with these closures, where the Park Service says this area will be open to vehicular traffic, a piping plover, for instance, a threatened species, not endangered, stops, makes a scratch in the sand, which is all they produce for a nest, is a scratch in the sand, And the area is immediately closed for 1,000 meters in every direction. 1,000 meters. That's a half a mile. If the president lands on Cape Point, they don't close it for a half a mile. If the Queen were to come here and walk down the beaches, it wouldn't be closed for a half a mile. But one bird land and scratch one nest, and it's closed for a half mile in every direction until such a time as that eggs are laid, birds are hatched, and the birds fledge or take their first flights. This is just excessive measures, which is kind of typical of what's happening through a lot of government agencies today. They don't operate with any forethought or any thought to the American public as a whole, and that's what we're asking for. National Park Service was sued by Audubon Society, Defenders of Wildlife, Southern Environmental Law Center, and they were told that we were not in, or the park was not in compliance with the rules written originally by Jimmy Carter, or actually written by Nixon and further extended by Jimmy Carter, that said any facility, national park, that was open to ORV driving had to have an ORV vehicle plan to write the rules and regulations that ORV drivers had to follow. This is not something new. This came about in the 70s, as you can recognize by the presidential names. At that time, we spent a lot of time reviewing what had to be done. When I say we, I mean North Carolina Beach Buggy Association, the Outer Banks Preservation Association, and we worked with the Park Service and with the local people and actually created a set of rules. Took them to the Park Service, they fully vetted them down here. There were multiple meetings, and the regulations, as we saw, as a Park Service, as a local Park Service saw necessary, were forwarded. Someplace between Atlanta, Georgia, which is the regional headquarters, and Washington, D.C., those regulations died. We as organizations thought, well, we did our job, it's done, and we never really addressed the problem until these three organizations sued the Park Service and said, you are out of compliance. In that lawsuit, there was a consent decree that was formulated, put together, and under the direction of a federal judge, Boyle, in eastern North Carolina, a consent decree was signed that said, okay, we will live within these parameters until such a time that a formal rules and regulations will be officially adopted. Well, we spent a year and a half in what's called regulated negotiations. During that time, we sat down at a table, at least sometimes monthly, sometimes weekly, and discussed what would be the future. Unfortunately, prior to us ever meeting, this lawsuit was filed, and the people that filed the lawsuits never would come to an agreement. In fact, they basically never negotiated with the rest of the people at the table. After about 14 and a half months, the National Park Service called the negotiations to an end because there wasn't a good, favorable answer. There wasn't any consensus amongst the individuals. One of the rules in our negotiations was unanimity. Everyone had to agree or else there was no agreement. That was never reached. When the negotiations were over, I believe it was 19 members of the negotiating committee got together, put together their ideas, their findings, and signed off on them and forwarded them to the National Park Service. Basically, we feel they were totally ignored. All the work, all the effort, and I'm talking about over 2 years worth of our time and efforts and the efforts of a lot of people, were basically ignored by the National Park Service. The first document that came afterwards was the DEIS, which is a draft environmental impact statement. Upon review of that last year, we went through, looked at it. There were A, B, C, D, E, and F, which were the alternatives Park Service or any federal agency has to publish and make available various alternatives. Park Service had a preference for one, we had a preference for another, as did others, and that's nature. Well, when it was finally adopted and it was sent up to or out west, wherever the final rule was written, basically everything that was written and submitted was forgotten, and the Park Service wrote in the rule the way they saw fit. It was released again under the format of FEIS, which is the Final Environmental Impact Statement. Again, it was written, and it was actually a more restrictive set of regulations than the DEIS was. And now it has been converted into a rule. On January the 20th of this year, the National Park Service released the final ORV rule for National Park here at Cape Hatteras National Seashore Recreational Area. And this is even further restrictive than were the previous two documents.